God, the kids take after your family. Can you imagine if they inherited her anxiety and predisposition to illness? We'd never get out from under it. My son-in-law, Mark's words weren't loud. They were spoken in a conspiratorial whisper, but to me, they boomed like a cathedral bell in an empty room. I froze on the threshold of the living room, hidden behind the lush ficus tree I had nurtured myself. In my hands, I held my grandson's birthday gift, a linen tablecloth on which I had spent weeks embroidering the initials of our ancestors, weaving them into the intricate pattern of a family tree. Mark said it while looking at my daughter, Eva, and she, my own flesh and blood, replied not with a word, but with a tired, assenting nod. A single, silent movement of her head, and with it she severed me from herself, from my grandchildren, from the entire lineage I had so cherished. My fingers clenched the fabric so tightly that my knuckles turned white. From the living room came the sound of guests laughing, the smell of roasted meat and sweet cake, the aroma of a celebration where I suddenly had no place. I didn't enter. I didn't make a scene. Something inside me snapped, quietly and irrevocably, like a delicate thread in my embroidery. I took a step back into the silence of the hallway. Carefully, as if it were a fragile artifact from a buried past, I placed the tablecloth on the small table by the mirror. Then, without looking back, I opened the front door and stepped out into the cool evening. The air smelled of cut grass and approaching rain. I walked home, and every step along the familiar street felt like a step into a new, unknown life. They probably didn't even notice I was gone. Silence greeted me at home. It was the same silence I used to fill with phone calls to Eva, with planning family dinners, with looking through old photographs. Now, it felt different, not oppressive, but pure, cleansing. I didn't turn on the lights, letting the twilight fill the rooms. My movements were slow, almost ritualistic. I put the kettle on and took out my favorite thin porcelain teacup, just one, not two, as I was accustomed to doing, always expecting a visitor. When the water boiled, I steeped mint leaves I'd grown in my own garden. The fragrance filled the kitchen. I sat at the large oak table where the whole family once gathered and stared out the window at the darkening sky. The warmth of the cup in my palms was the only warmth in the house. And in that moment, in that profound quiet, the cascade of memories began. The first to surface was Ireland, the year 2012. I remembered sitting at this very table, looking at a statement from my pension account. There was a little over $20,000 in it all that was left after my husband passed. Without a moment's hesitation, I withdrew $15,000. $15,000. For what I believed was the most important investment of my life, not in stocks or property, but in memory. I bought DNA tests for all of us, and plane tickets to the Emerald Isle, the homeland of my great-grandmother. I wanted to show Eva and the children the hills where our roots began, to let them feel the wind that carried the stories of our ancestors. I remember their faces. The grandchildren were thrilled by tales of leprechauns, but Eva smiled politely, took pictures of ruins, and complained about the damp. To her, it was just another vacation. To me, it was a pilgrimage. I thought I was giving them a legacy. It turned out I was just funding a tourist trip. That memory bled into another, sharper one. The day the DNA results arrived, I laid the printouts on the living room floor, like a biologist studying a complex organism. I showed them migration maps, explained haplogroups, and with a sense of awe, traced the threads that connected us to Vikings, to Celts, to the ancient tribes of Europe. I saw a miracle in it, scientific proof that we were part of the great river of life. "Mom, this is all interesting, of course," Eva had said then, flipping through the papers. "But what's the practical use?" And Mark had added, The main thing is that we're all healthy. Even then, they saw genetics as nothing more than a list of potential diseases and weaknesses. They looked at the code of life and searched for defects. I looked, and I saw poetry. I finished my tea. The bitterness of the mint mixed with the bitterness in my throat. I felt like a withered branch on the family tree, the one they dreamed of pruning so it wouldn't spoil the view. The thought flickered through my mind. Their fear of inheriting my anxiety, which I had always considered merely a depth of feeling, my predisposition to illness, which was really just a careful attention to my own body that fear had proven stronger than any blood tie. Eva's nod wasn't a betrayal of the moment. It was a verdict that had been maturing for years. They looked at my grandchildren and saw an escape from me, and I looked at them and saw my own continuation, of which I had just been deprived. The disappointment was so deep and so cold that there was no room left for tears or anger, only a crystalline, terrifying clarity. I stood up and, without turning on a light, walked to the old chest where I kept my most important documents. My hands were steady. I methodically pulled out a heavy folder. Inside were birth certificates, a marriage license, the deed to this house, and my will. I reread it. All my property, all my savings, the house, the land, everything was to go to Eva, my only daughter. I placed the document on the table. Then I walked to the phone. It was nearly midnight, but I knew my lawyer, an old family friend, would still be awake. I dialed his number. "Hello, Stephen? It's Edith. Forgive me for calling so late." "Yes, I'm fine. Better than ever, actually. I want to make changes to my will. Drastic changes." "No, I'm absolutely certain it involves a charitable trust." After I hung up, I felt not relief, but calm, a quiet, solid calm, like a stone at the bottom of a river. I walked to the wall in the living room where my masterpiece hung, in a gilded frame, the large, hand-drawn family tree I had spent decades creating. I stared for a long time at the names and dates, at the lines connecting generations. Then I carefully took the frame off the wall. I didn't tear the parchment. I rolled it neatly into a scroll, tied it with a ribbon, and placed it in the chest. The wall was now blank. That night, for the first time in years, I slept without dreams. I realized they had been so afraid of inheriting my weaknesses, it never occurred to them that they had failed to inherit my strength. And that strength, now, was mine alone. Stephen's office smelled of old paper, worn leather, and quiet authority. It was a sanctuary of order, the mahogany desk polished to a deep shine, the law book standing in silent, disciplined rows. It was the perfect antidote to the emotional chaos of the weekend. I sat in the armchair opposite him, my back straight, my hands resting calmly in my lap. My heart did not pound. The tremor that used to live in my fingers was gone. I felt a stillness I hadn't known in years. "So, Edith," he said, his voice gentle but professional, "you mentioned a charitable trust. That's a significant step." "It is," I replied, my voice even. "I want to amend my will. The entirety of my estate, the house, the savings, my investment portfolio, everything is to be used to establish an endowment. A trust for the local botanical garden." I paused, letting the words settle in the quiet room. "It will be called the Heritage Garden, dedicated to the preservation of rare and heirloom plant species." Stephen listened, his pen poised over a legal pad. "I want to leave a symbolic sum to my daughter, Eva." "How symbolic?" he asked, his eyes meeting mine, searching for any sign of doubt. There was none. $1,000, I said clearly, "with a stipulation in the will that it is for a DNA test to help her better understand her origins." A flicker of surprise crossed his face, but he was too much of a professional to comment. He simply made a note. I also want to revoke any and all power of attorney I previously granted her. The words felt clean, precise, like making a surgical incision. I was not destroying. I was correcting. This wasn't revenge. It was a repair. That afternoon, I returned not to my empty house, but to my garden. The world felt sharp and clear, the colors more vivid. I put on my old gardening gloves and took up my sharpest shears. For hours, I worked on the roses, my movements methodical and focused. There was a deep satisfaction in the crisp snap of the shears cutting through deadwood, the thorny branches that produced no blooms and only choked the healthy growth. I pruned away the weak stems, cleared the suckers that grew from the rootstock, and shaped the bushes so the sunlight could reach their hearts. With every branch that fell to the ground, I felt lighter. I was not just tending to my garden. I was clearing my life, making room for new blossoms. The rich scent of damp earth and crushed leaves was the smell of renewal. The next day was for finances. The bank lobby was cold and impersonal, the air filled with the quiet hum of computers and the sterile smell of circulated air. As I stood in line, a memory ambushed me, a flash of a much younger Eva, 19 and terrified, as I co-signed the document for her first student bank account right here in this building. I had squeezed her hand and told her, "This is for your future." Now, I was here to secure my own. When my turn came, I sat opposite a young woman whose name tag read, Brenda. "I'd like to close a joint savings account," I said, sliding the account documents across the counter. It was the emergency fund I had opened for Eva years ago, the one I had diligently contributed to and she had never touched. Her name was right there, next to mine. As Brenda typed, her nails clicking on the keyboard, I felt no sadness, only a sense of profound rightness. I had her access to my main checking account revoked and set up new online passwords, complex combinations of botanical names that she would never guess. I walked out of the bank feeling not poorer, but richer. The assets were now solely mine, their purpose redefined. When I arrived home, the red light on the answering machine was blinking insistently. One new message. I pressed the button and listened as Eva's voice filled the silent room, stretched thin with a manufactured panic. Mom, where are you? We were so worried when you left the party." "I've been calling all day. Please just call me back so I know you're okay. We're all very worried about you." I stood perfectly still, analyzing the words like a scientist studying a specimen. She wasn't worried. She was alarmed. An asset had gone offline. A resource had stopped responding. She was not checking on my well-being. She was checking on her inheritance. I pressed the delete button. The blinking red light went out. That evening, I undertook the final, most intimate repair. I opened the old chest and pulled out the records of a life intertwined with hers. Her birth certificate, her first report card, a lock of her baby hair. I did not burn them. A biologist does not destroy data. Instead, I took a clean archival box and placed each item inside, one by one. I created a new file folder for the legal documents relating to her and placed it in the box as well. I closed the lid and, with a black marker, wrote on a crisp white label, "Family History, Eva Miller." It was no longer a part of my present, but an artifact of my past. It was history, archived and stored. After that, I found the brochure for the local arts center I'd saved for years. My fingers traced the words, "Introduction to Ceramics." I picked up the phone and registered for the Tuesday evening class. My hands, which had spent a lifetime tending to roots in the ground, would now learn to create roots from the earth itself. On the way home from the center, after paying the registration fee, I did something I hadn't done in over a decade. I walked past the chain coffee shop that Mark preferred and went into a small, independent bakery Eva had always called fussy. The air inside was warm and smelled of butter, sugar, and yeast. Behind the glass, pastries sat like tiny jewels. I chose a single, perfect lemon tart, its yellow curd glistening under the lights. I didn't take it home. I walked to the nearby park, sat on a bench under a sprawling oak tree, and opened the small white box. The sun was warm on my face. I took a bite. The crust was buttery and crumbly, the lemon filling sharp and exquisitely sweet. I was no longer a root system for others. I was planting a garden for myself. The insistent knocking began on a Tuesday afternoon, just as I was preparing the clay for my second ceramics class. It was a frantic, impatient sound, entirely out of place in the calm of my home. I didn't need to look through the peephole. I knew that rhythm. It was Eva. I stayed where I was, at the sturdy wooden table in my sunroom, my hands covered in the cool, damp gray of the clay. The knocking stopped, replaced by the shrill buzz of the doorbell, pressed again and again. Silence. Then her voice, muffled by the thick oak door, sharp with an indignation that masqueraded as concern. Mom, open the door. I know you're in there. Your car is in the driveway. This isn't funny anymore. What is going on? Mark and I are worried sick. I closed my eyes and focused on the feeling of the clay beneath my palms, yielding yet solid, a substance that held no memory and offered infinite possibility. I methodically began to knead it, pressing down with the heels of my hands, folding it over, turning it, repeating the motion. The rhythmic thud of the clay hitting the table was the only answer I offered. Her voice came again, higher now, laced with frustration. Did you change the locks? Seriously? After everything we've done for you? Just open the door, Mom. We need to talk. Everything you've done for me. Asterisk, I thought, the phrase echoing in the quiet room. It was a fascinating choice of words. I continued my work, the clay transforming from a lumpy mass into a smooth, pliable sphere. My mother used to say, "Some people are like drums, Edith. You can only learn their true nature when you stop beating on them." I had stopped. And now, in the ensuing silence, I was finally hearing the hollow sound of their love. The buzzing stopped. The shouting ceased. I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway as she finally drove away. The quiet that descended upon the house was no longer an absence. It was a presence. It was mine. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I began an inventory of my life, not with documents and bank statements, but with memories. I walked through the house, my own private museum, letting the objects speak. My first stop was the small, worn armchair in the corner of the living room. The fabric was faded where countless heads had rested. It was here I had rocked a colicky Eva to sleep, humming lullabies until my throat was raw, my own exhaustion a distant second to her comfort. I could almost feel the phantom weight of her small, warm body against my chest, smell the sweet, milky scent of her baby breath. That warmth was immediately chased by a chill as a newer memory surfaced. Me, sitting in this same chair 2 years ago, recovering from a nasty bout of pneumonia, feeling weak and breathless. Eva had stood in the doorway, her coat on, keys in hand, sighing with impatience. "Mom, are you sure you can't watch the kids? It's just for a couple of hours. Mark's boss is having this dinner, and it's really important." I remember looking up at her, feeling the tightness in my chest, and whispering, "I can't, dear." I really can't breathe well today. The look of annoyance that crossed her face was sharper than any winter wind. She saw not her ailing mother, but an inconvenience. The chair held both memories, the selfless love and the selfish disregard. From there, I moved to the hallway, to the wall where a series of pencil marks documented Eva's growth from a toddler to a teenager. I ran my fingers over the faint lines and dated scribbles. Eva, age 5, as tall as the daffodils, asterisk. I remembered her bright, infectious laugh as she stood on her tiptoes, trying to make herself taller. I remembered her fierce pride at each new mark. That memory sat beside another. Mark, standing in this exact spot a few months ago, measuring my grandson, Leo. Look at that. A growth spurt, he'd boomed. He's got my family's height. Thank God he didn't get the short genes from, well, you know. He glanced at me with a quick dismissive smile, and Eva had said nothing. The wall wasn't just a record of Eva's height. It was a testament to their casual, continuous erasure of my legacy. My final stop was my own bedroom. On the nightstand sat a small, leather-bound book, a collection of Irish poetry my husband had given me on our 10th anniversary. I opened it, the spine cracking gently. The pages smelled of time and love. He had underlined a passage from Yeats, asterisk. But I, being poor, have only my dreams. I have spread my dreams under your feet. Tread softly, because you tread on my dreams. Asterisk, I had believed our family was built on those shared dreams. I had spread them under Eva's feet. And she, guided by her pragmatic husband, had not just trod upon them. She had ground them into the dirt with the heels of her sensible shoes. I closed the book. The inventory was complete. I understood now that I wasn't mourning the daughter I had lost, but the daughter I had never truly had. The loving, empathetic woman I remembered was a ghost, a character from the warm memories, who had long since been replaced by the weary, resentful stranger from the cold ones. I went to my desk and took out a fresh sheet of paper. With a steady hand, I made 2 columns. To keep, to leave. The to leave column was long. The heavy oak dining table, the formal silverware, the portraits of distant ancestors she'd found morbid. The to keep list was surprisingly short. At the top, I wrote, my books, my gardening tools, the clay wheel, my mother's recipes, asterisk. It was not a list of assets. It was a list of identities, thinker, creator, nurturer. It was a list of my future. The next day, I began the physical act of separation. The sun streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The house was quiet, save for the sound of packing tape being pulled from its roll. I worked with a calm, unhurried efficiency. This was not a frantic escape. It was a planned migration. I packed the books first, wrapping the most precious volumes, the poetry from my husband, my botany textbooks from college in soft tissue paper. They were the heaviest boxes, filled with the weight of knowledge and memory, but they felt like the lightest things I owned. The final box was the most important. It was small. Inside, I carefully placed the tools for my new life. The smooth, wooden modeling tools for my ceramics class. The small, leather-bound book of my mother's recipes, its pages stained with vanilla and butter from 100 shared baking sessions. My favorite pair of gardening shears, oiled and sharp. And on top of it all, I placed the smooth, perfectly centered sphere of clay I had prepared during Eva's visit. It was a lump of pure potential. I sealed the box and picked up a black marker. I didn't write kitchen or fragile. I paused, then wrote a single word on the clean white label, asterisk Genesis asterisk. When the last box was sealed, I stood in the middle of the living room and surveyed my work. The stacks of brown cardboard were like a series of quiet monuments to a life concluded. The empty spaces on the walls and shelves were not signs of loss, but of liberation. The room no longer seemed empty. It seemed clean, ready for new stories, stories that would be written without me. The days that followed were filled with a quiet, purposeful hum. The moving truck had come and gone, taking the boxes I'd marked for my new life, a small, bright apartment overlooking the very botanical garden I was now endowing. The rest of the house was being cleared out by an estate sale company, its contents to be sold, the proceeds added to the trust. I was systematically dismantling the stage on which my old life had been performed. Each phone call to the real estate agent, to the utility companies, to the movers, was a snip of another thread tying me to my past. I spent my last afternoons in the house, not in sadness, but in peaceful activity, sitting on the back porch, a place where I had once waited anxiously for their visits. Now I waited for nothing. I simply was. The sun on my skin felt like a blessing. I had spent so much of my life tending to the roots of my family tree. Now I was finally tending to my own. I wasn't mourning Eva anymore. I was mourning the idea of her, the beautiful, memory-polished version I had carried in my heart. The real Eva was a stranger whose calls I no longer answered. It was on one of those quiet afternoons, as I was wrapping my mother's favorite porcelain teapot in bubble wrap, that the phone rang. It was an unknown number. My first instinct was to ignore it, assuming it was Mark trying from a different line, but something made me answer. I picked it up and said nothing, just listened. For a moment, there was only hesitant breathing on the other end. Then, a small, familiar voice. "Grandma?" It was Leo, my 14-year-old grandson. His voice was unsteady, on the verge of breaking. "Grandma, it's me." "Leo." I held the teapot tighter. My own voice, when it came, was calm, stripped of all emotion. "Hello, Leo." Silence again, thick with unspoken things. Then a rushed whisper. I'm so sorry." The words were a fragile offering. The Edith of a month ago would have rushed in to soothe him, to absolve him, to say, asterisk, "Oh, darling, it's not your fault." Asterisk, but that Edith was gone. The new Edith remained silent, creating a space that he had to fill with truth. "For what exactly are you sorry, Leo?" I asked, my tone not accusatory, but genuinely curious. It was a biologist's question, seeking data. He stumbled over his words. For everything. For what Dad said. For Mom just letting him. For not saying anything. I heard them talking after. They were angry you left, not worried. They were talking about the house. About money. He took a shaky breath. It was ugly. I'm sorry I was a part of it. There it was. The truth. Not a vague, blanket apology, but a specific admission of complicity. He wasn't just sorry for their actions. He was sorry for his own silence. It was the first crack of light in a very dark room. "Thank you for saying that, Leo," I said softly. "That means a great deal." Can I see you?" he asked, his voice small. "Please? Just me." I thought for a moment. This was a test of my new walls to see if they were a fortress or a sanctuary. A fortress keeps everyone out. A sanctuary lets the right ones in. "Yes, you can," I said. "Come to the new apartment tomorrow at 4. I'll send you the address. And Leo, just you." He arrived precisely at 4, looking lost and much younger than his 14 years. My new apartment was still sparse, filled with the clean scent of fresh paint and the promise of a life yet to be lived. I hadn't prepared a feast. I had a pot of mint tea steaming on the counter and a plate of simple shortbread cookies. It was an offering, not a bribe. We sat at a small kitchen table, the silence between us awkward but not hostile. He finally looked at me, his eyes mirroring the confusion and hurt I had felt for so long. "Why are you doing all this?" he asked. "Mom says you're trying to punish them." I poured him a cup of tea, my hands steady. "This isn't about punishment, Leo. It's about truth. Your parents saw my love as a resource, my home as a future asset, my genetics as a liability. They built a relationship with me based on what I could provide, not on who I am. That foundation was faulty. And when a foundation is rotten, you don't just patch the cracks. You have to tear the whole thing down and build something new." I looked him in the eye. "You were quiet that day because you wanted to belong to them. I understand that. But their club has a very high price of admission: your own integrity." He looked down at his hands. "I don't want to be like that." "Then don't be," I said simply. We sat for another hour, talking more than we had in years. He told me about school, about his friends, about his fear that he was inheriting his father's temper. I didn't offer advice. I just listened, asking questions that helped him find his own answers. As it grew dark, he stood to leave. Can I come back?" he asked, his voice full of a hope so fragile it almost broke my heart. This was the moment. The old Edith would have said, "Of course, darling, any time. I'll bake your favorite cake." The new Edith offered a different contract. "Yes," I said, "you can come back. Not for cookies, not for gifts, not because it's your duty. You can come back when you have a truth to share or a question to ask. You can come back to sit in honest silence. That's the only reason for us to see each other now." I walked him to the door. I had wrapped a few of the shortbread cookies in a napkin. I pressed it into his hand. It wasn't a peace offering to the old family. It was provisions for his journey toward becoming a better man. He took it, his eyes filled with a gratitude that felt real. After he left, I stood by the large window of my new apartment, looking out at the sprawling green of the botanical garden below. The last rays of sun were setting the leaves of the old oak trees ablaze. My home had been a house of roots, obsessed with the past. This new place was a house of blossoms, open to the future. Perhaps some doors aren't meant to be slammed shut and barricaded. Perhaps they are meant to be quietly locked from the inside, leaving just a small window ajar, a window open only for those who learn to come alone and to knock softly. The morning of the final closing was crisp and bright, the autumn air holding a promise of cleansing cold to come. I dressed with deliberation. Not in the soft, comfortable clothes of my old life, but in a tailored pair of gray trousers, a silk blouse the color of cream, and a structured blazer. It was armor. Looking in the mirror, I saw not a 6-year-old widow, but a benefactor, a founder, the architect of a new legacy. My lawyer, Stephen, met me at the door of the title company. The office was a hushed, neutral space, smelling of clean carpets and brewing coffee, a world away from the emotional turmoil that had led me here. The documents were spread across a vast, polished table. I sat, took the heavy fountain pen Stephen offered me, and began to sign. My signature, once a familiar, looping script, was now more angular, more decisive. With each stroke, I felt a transactional finality that was deeply soothing. I was signing away the house, the physical vessel of a lifetime of memories both beautiful and painful. I was signing the final charter for the Heritage Garden Endowment, converting decades of accumulated material value into a living, growing entity that would outlive everyone in that room. When the last paper was signed, the closing agent, a woman with kind eyes, slid a folder across the table. "These are your copies, Mrs. Edith." I didn't take them immediately. Instead, I looked out the large window at the city below. For a moment, I saw it all with a biologist's clarity. a complex ecosystem of connections, some symbiotic, some parasitic. I had spent a lifetime in a parasitic relationship, allowing my life force to be drained away. Now, I was choosing symbiosis. I turned back to the table, picked up the pen one last time, took out a personal check from my purse, and wrote it out to the botanical garden. It was for the small surplus left over after all transactions. A final tidying up. I pushed the check and the signed folder back to Stephen. "Make sure this gets added to the trust," I said. My work here was done. I hadn't lost a home. I had liberated a future. I spent my last afternoon in the house, which now felt like a stranger's property, packing the final few items from my to-keep list. I carefully wrapped the old, hand-painted ceramic bird my husband had given me on our first Christmas together, its delicate tail feather having been glued back on twice by his clumsy, loving hands. I could almost smell the pine of that long-ago Christmas tree, hear the crackle of the fire. I placed it in a box cushioned with my softest sweaters. This was not just a belonging. It was a tangible piece of a love that had been real. The house was quiet, filled with the echo of what it once was. It was a perfect setting for the final act of emotional closure. The knock on the door was hesitant this time, almost timid. It was Mark. He stood on the other side, his voice strained and thin, stripped of its usual booming confidence. "Edith, please. I know you're in there. She's a wreck. We're all a wreck. I just want to understand." I remained in the living room, standing by the now empty bookshelf, tracing the dust lines where my books used to be. I did not move toward the door. "There is nothing to understand, Mark," I said, my voice carrying easily through the quiet house. "But why? Why are you doing this to your family? The familiar manipulation, the deployment of the word family as a weapon. My actions are not being done to you," I replied, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. "They are being done for me. You and Eva were concerned about inheriting my weaknesses. You never considered that you might also fail to inherit my strength." I apologize for what I said," he stammered, the words sounding foreign in his mouth. "It was a stupid thing to say. I didn't mean it." "Oh, but you did mean it," I countered softly. "You meant every word. It was perhaps the most honest thing you've ever said to me. You see my biology, my very essence, as a defect. And you were relieved to see it diluted in my grandchildren. The difference is, now I agree with you. It would be a tragedy for them to inherit your wife's weakness of character, or your profound lack of grace. You wanted to protect your children from my genetics. I am simply protecting my legacy from your values." There was a long, defeated silence on the other side of the door. Then, the sound of his footsteps receding down the path. As the sound of his car faded away, a tremor ran through me. The dam I had so carefully constructed for the past few weeks finally broke. I leaned against the empty bookshelf and wept. It was not a storm of grief, but a quiet, cleansing rain. 7 minutes of tears for 76 years of life, for the baby I had rocked, for the daughter I had loved, and for the woman I was finally, irrevocably letting go. When it was over, I felt clean, lighter, ready. That evening, I met my friends for tea, not at a cafe, but at my friend Clara's house, a place filled with the warmth of mismatched furniture, towers of books, and the rich aroma of cinnamon. Clara and Maggie were my true family now, the sisters of my choosing. We talked about everything and nothing about Maggie's disastrous attempt to bake sourdough, about the brilliant new Scandinavian noir series Clara was watching. They didn't ask probing questions. They simply created a space for me to be. "I signed the final papers today," I said, stirring my tea. The house is sold. The endowment is established. I move into the apartment on Friday. Clara reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Her touch was warm and firm. "To new beginnings," she said, her eyes shining. Maggie raised her teacup. "And to gardens that will bloom for 100 years because of a woman who finally decided to plant for herself." We clinked our cups together. The sound was small but resonant, a chime of true communion. Eva arrived the next day, using the key she must have had copied years ago. She didn't knock. She let herself in, her sense of entitlement her oldest and most familiar cloak. She stood in the entryway of the nearly empty house, her face a mask of pale, furious disbelief. She was holding a letter from Stephen, the formal notification of the changes to the will and the establishment of the trust. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling with rage as she shook the paper. "What have you done?" I was sitting on a packing box, calmly taping the seams. I looked up at her, my daughter, a stranger standing in the house she believed was hers. "I've secured my legacy," I said simply. "Your legacy," she spat the words. "This house was my legacy, my inheritance. You've given it all away to a bunch of flowers." "Precisely," I said, my calm unnerving her more than any shout would have. "Flowers don't express disappointment when you buy them the wrong kind of fertilizer. They don't whisper behind your back that they wish they'd grown from a different seed. They just grow toward the light. I've decided to follow their example. This is because of Mark, isn't it?" She tried, shifting tactics. "Because of one stupid comment. You're going to throw away your entire family over one mistake?" "This isn't about one comment, Eva. It's about a lifetime of them. It's about your silent nod of agreement. That was the moment I realized I wasn't your mother. I was a resource you were managing." I stood up, slowly. "I was the emergency fund, the free babysitter, the down payment, the emotional caretaker. But the role of mother in your life has been vacant for a very long time." "The children," she cried, playing her final, most desperate card. "What about the children? You're their grandmother. You're punishing them to get back at us." I took a step closer, my gaze unwavering, and then I delivered the truth that had been sitting at the heart of it all. "I am not punishing your children, Eva. I am protecting them. I am leaving them the most valuable inheritance I possibly can, the example of a woman who knew her own worth, something you were never able to give them. I saw the truth of it land in her eyes, a direct hit. You were so afraid they would inherit my anxiety. You never stopped to consider that true anxiety isn't a biological flaw. It's the constant, soul-crushing effort of trying to win the love of people who are incapable of giving it." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing, speechless for the first time in her life. "You'll be alone," she finally whispered, a curse and a prophecy. "You'll die old and alone in some tiny apartment." I almost smiled. It was the last arrow in her quiver, and it fell harmlessly at my feet. "No, my dear," I said, my voice filled with a profound and gentle pity. "I won't. True loneliness is not the absence of people. It is the absence of self. And I have finally, after all these years, found myself. I have my books. I have my friends. I have my work at the art center. I am planting a garden that will live forever. My life has never been more full." I walked to the small table by the door, where one last item remained. It was the linen tablecloth I had embroidered for Leo's birthday. I had retrieved it from the old house. I picked it up and held it out to her. "This is for you," I said. "It's a family tree, so you can remember where you came from, and so you can explain to your children why you chose to be the final withered branch." She flinched as if I'd struck her. She wouldn't take it. I let it drop to the floor between us. A soft, white surrender. She looked from the tablecloth to my face, searching for a crack in my resolve, for the tearful, forgiving mother she knew how to manipulate. But that woman was gone. Defeated, she turned and walked out the door, leaving it open behind her. I watched her go, then stepped forward and gently closed it. The click of the latch was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I did not feel joy, nor did I feel sadness. I felt only a vast, sovereign quiet. It was not the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of peace. The final thread was severed on a Monday morning. The call came from Stephen, his voice warm with a professional satisfaction that mirrored my own. "It's all done, Edith," he said. "The final transfer to the endowment is cleared. The sale of the house is officially recorded. Every last asset has been allocated according to your instructions." He paused, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "As of this morning, you are the sole decision-maker in every inch of your life. Congratulations." The words hung in the air of my small, bright apartment, not as a legal statement, but as a benediction. I thanked him, my voice steady, and hung up the phone. I felt a quiet click inside me, the sound of the last lock falling into place. Later that day, I walked to the local post office. It was a simple errand, the last on my long list of administrative tasks. The clerk handed me a small, bronze-colored key, the key to my new mailbox. It felt heavier than the key to the old house ever had. As I walked back, the key felt cool and solid in my palm. It wasn't just a key to a box that would hold bills and junk mail. It was the key to a life where I, and only I, controlled who had access. It was the key to my sovereignty. Leo called that weekend. "Can I come over?" he asked, his voice no longer tentative, but clear and confident. "I finished that thing I was telling you about." He came to the old house one last time, where I was gathering the last of my gardening tools. We didn't sit in the formal living room, steeped in ghosts. Instead, we sat on the back steps in the warm afternoon sun, a plate of simple oatmeal cookies between us. The atmosphere was light, easy. We were not a grandmother and grandson navigating a family crisis. We were two friends, enjoying a quiet moment. "Mom's still furious," he said, not with malice, but as a simple statement of fact. "She says you've erased her, that you've stolen her past and her future." I broke a cookie in half and handed him a piece. "She thinks I've stolen her house and her inheritance," I corrected gently. "But what she's really mourning is the version of me that existed only to serve her needs. The mother who would absorb any amount of neglect and call it love. She doesn't miss me, Leo. She misses my function." I looked out at the garden I had tended for 50 years, its autumn colors muted and beautiful. You can't erase something that was never truly there for you to begin with. He nodded, understanding. Then he reached into his backpack and pulled out a small, framed object. It was a drawing, rendered in charcoal with surprising skill. It depicted a single, ancient tree, not unlike the one I had sculpted in my ceramics class. But this tree was different. Its roots were deep and gnarled, but its branches were not weighed down with the names of ancestors. Instead, they were reaching, stretching upward toward a brilliant sun, bursting with new leaves and blossoms. At the bottom, in careful script, he had written a single word, Genesis. Tears pricked my eyes. The first I'd shed not from sorrow, but from a profound, heart-swelling joy. It was the most beautiful gift I had ever received. It was a reflection not of who I had been, but of who I had become. "It's for the new apartment," he said shyly. "So you have a new family tree." "Thank you, Leo," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. I held the drawing to my chest. "I will hang it where I can see it every single day." The morning I left the old house for the last time, a soft mist hung over the garden, muffling the world in a gentle silence. The rooms, stripped bare, echoed with every footstep. They were no longer mine. They were a vessel, waiting for new life. I walked through each room, my hand trailing along the walls, the door frames, the window sills. I didn't feel the sting of loss. I felt a deep, quiet gratitude. Gratitude for the laughter that had once filled these halls, for the lessons learned within these walls, for the strength I had forged in its silence. On the clean kitchen counter, where I had once left cooling pies, I left the old house key. Beside it, I placed a small, simple note. It didn't say goodbye or good luck. It said only, asterisk, thank you for the shelter. Asterisk. I walked out the front door and, without looking back, pulled it shut. My new apartment building was bright and modern, smelling of new paint and citrus cleaner. The building manager, a cheerful woman named Sarah, handed me my welcome packet and a small potted orchid. A little something to help you grow in your new home, she said with a smile. The gesture was small, but it felt immense. It was the first housewarming gift I'd received that came with no strings attached. The movers were efficient and respectful, placing the boxes in the designated rooms. When they left, I was alone, surrounded by the sealed brown monoliths of my past. I didn't know where to begin, so I started small. I opened the box marked asterisk Genesis asterisk. The first thing I unpacked was my electric kettle. Simple comfort. The second was Leo's drawing, a link to a new, honest future. I hung it on the most prominent wall in the living room, its vibrant energy instantly making the space my own. The last thing I took out was the small ceramic bird my husband had given me. I placed it on the windowsill overlooking the botanical garden. It was a blessing from a love that was pure, a reminder that I was capable of both giving and receiving it. A week later, a new rhythm had begun to take hold. I found the old letter I'd been looking for, tucked inside a book of poetry. It was from my husband, written on our 20th anniversary. Asterisk, my dearest Edith. Asterisk, it read. Asterisk, you spend so much of your life cultivating the world around you. Please, never forget to cultivate the garden of your own soul. It is the most beautiful of all. Asterisk. Reading his words now felt like a confirmation, a permission slip from the past to embrace my present. That afternoon, I decided to bake, not an elaborate cake for a birthday or a pie for a family gathering. I made a simple loaf of sourdough bread for myself. The process was a meditation, the feeding of the starter, the slow kneading of the dough, the patient waiting as it rose. The apartment filled with the warm, yeasty, life-affirming smell of baking bread. When it was done, I sliced off a thick, warm piece and slathered it with butter and my homemade jam. It was the most delicious thing I had ever tasted. Leo came by later, as he did most Saturdays now. He found me on my small balcony, surrounded by pots of soil, carefully planting herb seeds. He didn't come with expectations. He brought his bike, and we spent an hour together figuring out how to fix its broken chain, our hands greasy, our conversation easy and meandering. We were simply two people, enjoying a shared task. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the garden below, he looked out at the view. "Is this what peace feels like, Grandma?" he asked quietly. I thought for a moment, watching a lone hawk circle in the vast, open sky. "No," I said, smiling. "This is not all of peace. This is just my peace, and for the first time in my life, it is enough." I didn't miss the house. I didn't miss Mark's bluster or Eva's brittle smiles. I didn't miss the old version of myself, the one who lived on scraps of affection, who whispered, asterisk, "Maybe this time they will see you." Asterisk, because I saw myself now. I saw the woman who could build a legacy from scratch, who could cultivate love from a single honest seed, who could bake bread just to delight her own soul. I was the gardener, the soil, and the seed, and I no longer needed anyone else's permission to bloom. They say a tree must lose its leaves to survive the winter. It is an act of profound surrender, a letting go, not in defeat, but in wisdom. The tree does not mourn the loss of each leaf. It understands this shedding is necessary for the preservation of its core, for the eventual promise of new spring growth. For months, I had been shedding the leaves of my old life, the expectations, the resentments, the ghosts that haunted the rooms of my past. The final leaf was the house itself, the last material tie to a life that no longer fit me. The news of its final sale arrived in a sterile email from Stephen, a number on a screen, a formal confirmation that the transaction was complete. I felt no surge of triumph, no pang of loss. I had already mourned the house, mourned the family it was meant to hold. This was simply the final, quiet rustle of a leaf falling to the ground. That afternoon, I walked to the bank and had the cashier's check made out. It was a staggering sum, the culmination of a lifetime of work and careful investment. I held the slip of paper in my hand, feeling its weight, not as money, but as potential. The director of the botanical garden, a woman named Dr. Althea Sharma, with kind, intelligent eyes and soil under her fingernails, met me in her small, sun-drenched office, which smelled of damp earth and blooming orchids. I handed her the check. She looked down at the amount, and her composure momentarily faltered. Her eyes widened, and she looked back up at me, speechless. "This," she began, her voice a whisper, "this will change everything. This will fund our conservation efforts for decades. I don't know what to say." I smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. "There's nothing to say. Just make things grow." I paused, looking past her to the sprawling green canopy visible through her window. "This is for the roots that are forgotten, for the seeds that need a second chance to bloom." I had cried all the tears I had for my own withered roots. This was not an act of grief. It was an act of planting. My new apartment had become a sanctuary, not just for me, but for Leo. He started visiting every week, arriving with a quiet knock and a sense of relief, as if he were an exile finding his embassy. One Saturday, he came carrying a worn cardboard box. "Can I leave this here?" he asked, his gaze averted. "It's my stuff, my drawings, my books. Dad says they're a waste of space. He wants me to focus on sports." I took the box from him, its weight more emotional than physical. It was his soul in a box, the parts of himself he was being taught to hide. "Of course," I said, placing it carefully in the bottom of my wardrobe. "It will be safe here." We sat at my small kitchen table, a comfortable silence between us. He was sketching in a notebook while I repotted a struggling fern I'd rescued from the building's lobby. "Do you think they'll ever change?" he asked suddenly, not looking up from his drawing. The "they" hung in the air, heavy and understood. I gently loosened the fern's tangled roots, teasing them apart. "Change is a difficult thing, Leo. It requires a person to look at their own reflection and not like what they see. That takes a courage that not everyone has." I placed the fern in its new pot, filling it with fresh, dark soil. A better question might be, can they ever stop pretending? Your mother pretends to be a victim. Your father pretends to be a pragmatist. They've built a whole world on those pretenses. It's easier to blame the mirror for the reflection than to change the face looking into it. He was quiet for a long time after that, but when he left, he seemed to stand a little taller. The bond between us was no longer just about genetics. It was forged in the quiet spaces of shared truth. A letter arrived a few weeks later. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakably Eva's K. It had been forwarded from the old address. I let it sit on my counter for a full day, a silent testament to a world I no longer inhabited. The next morning, with my first cup of coffee, I opened it. The letter was not angry. It was a rambling, disjointed tapestry of confusion, regret, and self-pity. It spoke of sleepless nights, of the hollow feeling in the old house before it sold, of Leo's growing distance. It ended with a question that was both a plea and an accusation. "Don't you miss me at all?" I read the words slowly, letting them wash over me without penetrating. I felt a distant, clinical pity for the woman who wrote them. She wasn't asking if I missed her. She was asking if I missed being needed by her, if I missed the role she had assigned me. I folded the letter neatly. I did not tear it up. I did not burn it. Tearing it would have given it power, an act of emotional reaction. Instead, I opened the bottom drawer of my desk, a drawer I rarely used, and placed the letter inside. I was not forgiving her, nor was I condemning her. I was simply filing her away. I was giving her pain a place to exist, but that place was no longer inside of me. My 77th birthday began not with the anxious anticipation of a phone that might not ring, but with the quiet hum of my own kettle. The sun streamed through the large windows of my apartment, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, celebratory sprites. I made myself a small stack of pancakes, drizzling them with the maple syrup Maggie had brought back from Vermont. I ate them slowly, savoring each bite, sitting at my new table, the one that seated 4, but felt perfectly full when it was set for 1. Leo arrived in the afternoon. He didn't bring a store-bought gift wrapped in glossy paper. He handed me a single, hand-folded piece of cardstock. Inside was a pressed flower, a resilient purple wildflower from the grounds of the botanical garden, and a short, handwritten poem. It wasn't perfect, but it was profoundly real. It spoke of deep roots and new blossoms. It was a reflection of me, seen through his clear, honest eyes. "I'm thinking of volunteering at the garden," he told me as we shared a pot of tea. "The director, Dr. Sharma, said they're starting a youth program with the new funding from the Heritage Garden Endowment." He looked at me, a new admiration in his eyes. "You're different, Grandma. You seem calmer, like a person who doesn't startle anymore." My days settled into a rhythm of quiet joy. In the mornings, I would work with my clay, the spinning wheel a meditative hum, my hands learning to shape beauty from the earth. My rescued fern, once pale and limp, was now thriving, unfurling new, vibrant green fronds in the sunlight. In the afternoons, I would walk in the gardens, watching families and couples stroll the paths that my legacy was now preserving. Clara and Maggie came for dinner every Thursday. We didn't talk about the past. We talked about books, politics, and the hilarious intricacies of online dating at 70. Our laughter was the warmest sound in my new home. One evening, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unsaved number. "Happy birthday, Mom." I read the words from Eva, felt a flicker of the old sadness, and then nothing. I did not reply. I simply put the phone down, my heart as calm as a still lake. Later that night, I sat at my desk and opened my journal. The first page, written months ago in a state of shock and grief, felt like a dispatch from another lifetime. I turned to a fresh, clean page. The question that had started this all, the one whispered with such casual cruelty, echoed in my mind. Why is she still alive? I picked up my pen, and now I could finally answer. I am alive to feel the sun on my face without apology. I am alive to set my own table, knowing that all who sit here are welcome guests, not entitled heirs. I am alive to build a garden that asks for nothing but light, and to keep the door to my own life locked, leaving the key only for those who know how to knock with gentle hands.